Right. Welcome to round 7 of Australs 2022. On the affirmative, we have UT Mara 2, and on the negative, we have UP Los Banos 1. The motion before the House today is that as a foreign judge on the CFA, we would resign. Without any further ado, I'd like to invite the first affirmative to start the debate.
I'm just checking my audible and visible.
Yep, you're audible and visible, but there was like a slight connection issue, I think. Can you try to speak a longer sentence, maybe?
Am I like so much more clearer now, or
Oh yeah,
like
it's
still
fine
lagging?
now. It's okay now. Thank you.
Starting my speech in 3, 2. The banner of my existence, if I were a judge, is in order for me to administer justice, because this is the only reason why I went through those hellish years in law school, in order for me to at least serve the people back. Because that is the sole reason why you're even there as a judge, especially in the Court of Final Appeal. To understand why is this quintessential is to understand that it's also the way that Hong Kong has always been developed from the 1950s in terms of how their law has been. This means that the legal fraternity is one that is developed, is already grounded. But the problem here is also because this is the same court that is going to uphold the constitutional rights. Yet we are also still very much influenced by the Chinese government. This means that we are going to foresee a lot of more exercise. We will be foreseeing a lot of more obstruction in terms of justice, because we see that the current chief is like Xi Jinping is actually silencing a lot of political dissent. This looks like, for example, Chinese national security law are also things that the Chinese security law is actually overruling a lot of the CFA's rulings are actually things in terms of how you can have detention without trial, how you have disproportionate sentencing, right? And it's also the way you have breach of privacy. You're banning any form of anti-government content that is supposed to be the hallmark of democracy in Hong Kong, especially. We say to you that the Chinese government will strike down the constitutional rights from the that is already given by the CFA. Understand that it's very necessary to understand that the Court of Final Appeal is one that is in terms of the levels of judicial interference. These are the people or the panel that is very quintessential in order for them to uphold the idea that constitutional rights is here to stay. The problem is that if even to understand the process is that you go from the High Court and then to appeal, and the final appeal is the only way and is the last resort to things. This means that even on the last resort of things, you don't actually have any say. We say to you the role for being in the judiciary is ineffective in this instance. So to you then 2 arguments. Number 1, understand that why that we should this is not principally aligned as to why this is just not principally aligned as a judge for you to be part of the obstruction to the rule of law, especially in Hong Kong. Because the first off, that the framing here is to understand that the unique difference of Hong Kong is in their rule of law that protects the people's freedom. They're the hallmark and the essence of that the society's function. It's very important to understand that in contrast to how they are being upheld by the CCP. This means that they are supposed to be the bastions of the people's rights and freedom, right? I think that's also the way that secondly on the level of why, if you continue to be in a system where your efforts are wasted, this means that considering the fact that Xi Jinping's policy is currently actively interfering with the judicial system, you are currently going to be the witness of a crumbling you're going to be a witness to the crumbling legal fraternity in which you're supposed to protect essentially the constitutional rights that are very much necessary to the people on the ground. What this also means is that because you are in principle, you are used as a perception to how the rule of law has been in Hong Kong. What you're now going to be is a puppet to the Chinese government for being the metrics to administer justice. You're the people that is actually you are the person that's actually given legitimacy in terms of how people are going to perceive the rule of law is being administered in Hong Kong in this reason. The comparative here are 2 things. Number 1, understand that the impact here. Number 1, we refuse and will not exist, will cease to exist in the judicium that is already abused, and we say that this is fine, even if you want to say that you want to actually have some form of internal reform. You're a single panel, and we tell you that 3 other like 3 other of like your fellow panelists are already resigned, we told you that this is not unprecedented. It's also the way that we refuse to be there because because you do not have the ability to perform your role effectively. Therefore, the comparative here is that even if you were there in order for you to like, if like side negative wanted to say that you wanted to create any form of like internal change, the problem here is that your most powerful function of actually upholding the rule of law and administering justice cannot be effective. You cannot effect change, and this at the end of the day means that you're supporting the regime in which you're supposed to actually like, you're actually supposed to protect for the people from the people, right? I think like then we go on to my second argument to understand that why as a judge it hurts the role to administer justice, and therefore you are actually rendering the role of like the judicial sector in Hong Kong especially to be ineffective and therefore like illegitimate in this instance, right? I think that first off is to understand the framing here is that your inability to perform the role effectively is significant of how the judiciary will also appear, because you are reflective of like you are reflective and an image to like how the judiciary is actually being upheld. Understand that these foreign judges are there in order for you to like uphold the common law jurisdictions, which are things that are necessarily about equity. You're also going to uphold about things that are necessarily about that necessarily follows the lines of like principles of justice and principles of and in this instance, this also means that you as you are a forefront or you are a public image, right? This also means you're going to affect the public trust. How does this do, right? I think the second level here is to understand that how does it actually affect the legitimacy of the legal fraternity or basically the judiciary in Hong Kong. Understand that in an ineffective role, this means that you're not going to be able to do anything that is actually questionable by the CCP. Understand that because of like the standing committee, like because the standing committee or the Politburo in China is actually having like a significant influence in terms of like the basic laws that are already there in Hong Kong, and yet now they are adding up to that by actually saying that you do not get to exercise your constitutional rights that are supposed to be upheld in the Court of Final Appeal. This means that a lot of things that you do are actually insignificant because any amount of effort that you are doing is only in terms of like providing legitimacy as to like how people can see that the court that necessarily CCP is actually like the Chinese government has way more exertion of right over what happens in Hong Kong, which is very much detrimental to people in Hong Kong, because this means you are sent there to ensure that the laws are supposed to be significant protecting people. But now what you're doing is now the perception is that in the eyes of the public, you are legitimizing a fracture. You are legitimizing a legal fraternity that is already broken. But lastly, how this actually perpetuates for even more harm to happen from allowing them to be hijacked by the Chinese state government, right? I told you that necessarily that number one, understand that currently because there is an active influence that Xi Jinping's government is trying to like Xi Jinping and the standing committee is trying to like affect how Hong Kong is being perceived, because they want to like reclaim Hong Kong entirely and want to have way more control in terms of like what kind of language that you want to use, what kind of like laws that should be upheld, or what kind and also in terms of like trying to silence any form of like anti-mainland China kind of dissent. These are things that we necessarily understand that because of the fact that even if you actually allow, like even if you stay there, this means that you're always going to be a puppet to like the Chinese state government, because you are allowing them to actually just exercise whatever jurisdiction that they want upon you, and you really cannot do anything much because a lot of your peers are already gone. But it's also the fact that you are a single judge, therefore in a lot of instances you don't actually have a lot of power. It's also the way that this means that you are also hurting you are also hurting the way that you are going to be appeared as a person that is supposed to be interfering and provide any form of like, equitable decisions. But lastly is to understand, because of the fact that you are just there and you cannot have any form of effective change, this means that the best way for you to even have any form of like silence, like in order for you to have like the safest form of protesting is for you to resign for these reasons. Affirmative.
Thank you very much for that kind speech. Now I'd like to invite the first negative speaker.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yep.
Great. Let me just set up my timer. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. When you're a representative of some of the strongest democratic bastions of the world, When looking at a state that is battling against the impeccable force of authoritarianism, your reaction is not to quit or let yourself be a puppet, but to fight tooth and nail to make sure that that evil never succeeds. What is the incentive of that CFA judge, of that foreign CFA judge in Hong Kong? We think that it's in a lot of manifestations. Number one, as a judge, you have probably dedicated your entire life in calling into judging and being judicious and making a huge impact. To an extent, AF agrees with this. This means that being a foreign federal judge is one of the highest honors that you have, and you ought not to abandon it as your mandate to do so. Second, you have a limited career as a judge. This means you ought to maximize the value of your career. That means doing your best in every delegation, in every assignment that you have. Second, the fact that they're appointed there by their home country means that they have an inherent obligation and mandate to put Hong Kong's best interest first. This is because they aid Hong Kong judges with rulings, adjudication, and discernment of national policy. That means they direct Hong Kong with how they should decide on laws, decide on policies, etc. This is irregardless of the judge's personal values and opinion. They have the incentive to be a great judge. And the only way for them to be a great judge is to put Hong Kong's interest first. Third, the jurisdiction of which these judges came from have strong democratic institutions. This means that their ideologies are heavily judicious and democratic. What this means is they have an inherent opposition against the very authoritarian rule of China and the state violence thing that they have going on. This means that they have to offer a strong counter narrative against the push of China to be authoritative and to put Hong Kong on their leashes. But secondly, this also means that they have some of the best and objective judges of the world. This is the cream of the crop individuals. And this is how I respond to AF's framing. This means that they're not likely to become a puppet to the Chinese government and just mimic their decision. They're mandated to uphold the values of democracy. So they're not going to parrot, for example, what China's decisions are. They're going to fight for their values. They're going to fight for Hong Kong's democracy. And therefore, that's how they're going to push for the policies. But this is compounded by the fact as well that China's rarely overturned CFA rulings by the virtue of the impost line. This means that your influence and power as a CFA judge is something that is to be worried about by China when they try to be intrusive against you. But thirdly, lastly, definition of this is that they're delegated to these countries by sheer competence. They're the best judges in their own country and to some extent in the world as well. What this means is that the decisions that they make are most likely to be legitimate, objective, and to be of great benefit towards the people of Hong Kong. But lastly, you're going to be extremely competent in your judgment as well. So we question AF argument that they're just going to quiet quit, for example, their job and just resign and be a puppet in the event that they stay. Lastly, they have diplomatic incentives by virtue of being representative to their countries. This is because the process of appointment to the CFA requires that you as a foreign national have some degree of state backing as well. That means they have things like democratic immunity, the diplomatic protection from their host countries as well. So that means arguments about safety cannot fly under AF side. What is the China's national security law, right? And what it means for Hong Kong. This is the second piece of framing that I'll offer in this debate. The national security law was implemented by China as a response to an ever-increasing dissidence in Hong Kong. This means that they're no longer allowed to secede, for example, Hong Kong as a state to China. But second, they've expanded the definition of what terrorism is. So this means that things like public assembly and protest can be decided as such, or red tag protesters and define them to be terrorists, right? But third, the extradition of Hong Kong offenders to be ruled in mainland Chinese courts is also a manifestation of the Chinese national security law. The relevance of this definition is that the national security law is designed to be intrusive against Hong Kong's ruling and designed to be inequitable against them. That is to subjugate them under mainland China's policies. What does it mean then for a judge to walk back, for example, and resign on their job? What is the impact of this? And this is what AF lacks in their analysis. It means that you have to make Hong Kong much more vulnerable to the very harmful effects of the national security law. This is because you offer no strong counter narrative to counter China's rulings in the CFA. That means they're able to invade the CFA and to repeal a lot of the work that you've done as a judge there as well, and to just make Hong Kong much more vulnerable to authoritarianism and being annexed by China as a state. Our burden then is to prove, number one, why is this in the interest of the judge to stay there, do their job, and uphold democracy, and how that fulfills their mandate in work. But conversely, that means AF side has to defend a judge that walks out, gives up on their principle, the principles of the host state that sent them there, and their mandate, for example, as an inherent objective or adjudicator of the law. First argument I'll give to you in this debate is the loss of one judge is something that is extremely damaging to Hong Kong. This is because there are already 3 judges that have resigned, as given in the info slide. What this means is the CFA has already lost some sense of influence or some sense of power, for example. What does this mean? Three explanations to what this means. This means that the quality of legal systems in Hong Kong has started to degrade already. In Hong Kong, they've started to extradite more and more prisoners to China. They have lessened their power and frequency of jury trials. But second, this simply means that we need to offer a stronger counterbalance against China's invasive policies, such as the national security law. Since we're the only mechanism that exists in status quo to counter it by sheer influence and by sheer scale, right? This means that it is our moral imperative to stay and to reinforce the institutions that protect Hong Kong's democracy, that protect Hong Kong's influence to exert democracy in their own people. The power is on the very influence side as well. As I said earlier, it's rare that China overturns decisions of the CFA. This means that they care about what the CFA puts and they're bound to agree or at least follow along, for example, with the kind of decisions the CFA makes. In fact, what this means is instead of leaving, right, you have to stay. You have to stay and increase, for example, reinforce the democratic institutions of Hong Kong. If you allow me to copy paste some of the analysis earlier, you are mandated by your power as a judge and to be as judicious as possible. You're mandated by your obligation to your home state to spread democracy and to protect democratic institutions in any place you're assigned to, right? But second piece of analysis is the cascading effect of resignation. If we assume that judges have equal influence and power and equal interest as well, one judge pulling out is bound to create a cascading effect. This is relevant to the actor and important to the actor for several reasons. Number one, they have a personal commitment to the law, as I said earlier, if you let me copy paste my analysis. Second, they represent the interests of their states against China. This is because China is inherently being anti-democratic, for example, in the global stage. Therefore, countries, for example, like Australia or other, for example, delegations that these countries come from, want to offer a strong counter-narrative to spread democracy and to counter China's influence, for example, in their neighbors. That's why they care about Taiwan as well. That's why they care about other countries like Tibet, for example. That's why they protect the institutions there as well. But third, they're decent human beings who wouldn't want to see Hong Kong be abused by China as well. So in as much as there's a strong moral pull for them to stay, it is within their interest to do so as well. But fourthly, this is because they care about the quality of their life's work. What happens if they resign and all of their work gets repealed means that their work is going to be put into waste. And as a judge who cares about their work and the kind of legacy that they leave as a judge, we think that they don't want that. They want their work to be preserved. They want their work to be upheld for as long as they physically can. But thirdly, right, resignation is seen as a concession to the part of the actor. This is intuitively true for reasons like they don't want to feel incompetent and they feel like they need to do something for the state. In the moment that they choose to resign, their work goes to waste because China can now easily repeal their work. This is relevant for 3 reasons. Number one, it means that they fall into their own interest, their work, their dedication, but they also fail the interest of their home state, as I said earlier. But this is also their core of being a foreign judge, and they simply don't want to walk away from that. If the judge really cares about his work, his state, the fact that they have to protect democracies in ways that they can and to counter China by as much as possible, it is only on side neck that you get to do that. Proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. Now I'd like to invite the second affirmative.
Hi, checking if I'm audible and visible.
Yep.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think the principle of being a judge is to essentially have justice prevail. This is the correct premise in which negative doesn't want to engage, because all the justice, all the democracy, all the values do not really stand a chance at the point in which we tell you that there's already been judicial interference, judge. Few structure response, right? Number one, let's try to analyze what are the efficacy of the rule or the judges within Hong Kong. I think the framing here is to really understand where does the national security law actually stand, because this is a big constitutional issue that has been literally affecting the most vast majority of the people within within like Hong Kong. So therefore, the deadlock breaker in trying to understand which side pertains is better is to prove how the judges can actually fight from a constitutional issue that is now tarnished by the CCP. Negative has never proven to us the way or the pathway for victory under their side. The only best scenario that they can tell us, based on the info slide, is just that there has been a rare occasion. But the truth is, at the point in which you are detained with no trial, at the point in which you can no longer have freedom of expression and that there's no social media outlet that you can essentially go to, we don't necessarily think that you can beat the CCP at this particular point, understanding that the constitutional itself is interpreted by them themselves. But what did we prove here, panel? We proved to you that there will be a sort of protest, that even if it is a soft power, that at a point in which where you have a foreign judge resign themselves, proves to the point of the international setting that they are principled and that China can no longer blanket the fact that they do not have a rule of law and have these foreigners as legitimacy. Now, let's understand the interests of judges, because notice that negative only wanted to talk about, maximizing their career, that they had been in the mandate. We think the mandate here is to understand that they have to perform their role, which supersedes the interests of the Hong Kong citizens, right? At the point in which there are no longer efficacy within their role, that's the point in which you go against your mandate. But let's understand then, they say, aha, you are not acting as an extension of your home country. We think you are legitimizing the rule of law that does not even exist. Democracy is an underlying issue within Hong Kong and China, and at the point in which you do have your democratic beliefs from your home country, you are essentially making it very much superficial. But lastly, let's understand what has CCP done. Notice that the chief executive was chosen by them, that they can no longer do reviews based on like judicial review that the court of final appeal can even do, that there isn't even really democracy within that particular situation. But then they say that now you'll be able to repeal any of the issues or any of the laws and cases that has been made. We think that law doesn't work that way, panel. This is untrue. We think that at the point in which it has been made, there is already a precedent. We don't think that it will just be diluted simply because you resign. That's a premise that's false. Now, two issues I'll bring in for today. The first is to weigh to you exactly what are the differences when they resign and when they do not resign. And I'll bring you a positive material, which is to tell you the symptomatic to a dysfunctional system and why you can gain support from the international scene. So first off, onto the first issue, which is the weighing. Why is this very important, right? Because notice how negative also wants to gain all of the benefits of democracy, of having change within Hong Kong, right? But then we on the other side would also want to suggest to you that in order for you to change that is simply by resigning. So the metric needs to become, what is the interest of a foreign judge simply by the motion, right? Why is this the metric, judge? Understand that they have their principles regardless. And number two, that they have to act as the best person and have the best interest within judiciary. So how do we prove this, right? This thing. Number one, let's mitigate the harm of them being needed within the judiciary system of Hong Kong. I think it's important to characterize that China is using foreign judges to gain legitimacy, to prove that there is rule of law in Hong Kong when there isn't, right? i.e., they cannot review the national security law or be it any other particular law that actually affects most of the people. So the first level to this is to understand what is the development of Hong Kong. We think it has matured. So most legal methods have been answered, and once that is made, there is already a precedence that has happened, whether that be in terms of property or whether that be in terms of civil. So based on the common issue that most people go through, there is already a precedence made by Hong Kong. The impact here is that at the point in which you can rely on precedence and you can rely on the hierarchy of courts, the normal matters don't really essentially gain any disadvantage for the particular people in Hong Kong. So even at this point, if you were to resign, there's not really a drastic occasion. But B, understand that there already exist the Hong Kong judges within that particular state. Negative may say that they can be inexperienced, but they cannot get away with that. Why? Because we've proven to you that foreign judges cannot practice their right duty effectively. So the comparative here is now you have the same you have the same power between Hong Kong judges and even foreign judges simply because they are bound by the constitutional that CCP essentially interprets. Now, let's move on to my second issue, right? Which is to understand the symptomatic to a dysfunctional system. And this is in a point to tell you why we can actually gain support of international eyes, which will like engage and break all of their arguments on how they can create change within Hong Kong. Why is this a very important issue? Because Hong Kong can no longer practice the rule of law. So defending them is based on what China has. Regardless of the change in benefit that comes under a negative side, they cannot tell us simply that they can do it optimally. Understand that it was a rare occasion once again, but understand that even if you were to practice that, you will still be struck down by China. So CCP can also interpret the basic law in Hong Kong, whether that be constitution. So there is no check and balance within negative side. The metric needs to become, what are the rule of laws that can be practiced? Why? Because it determines the extent of influence that the judge actually can practice. How do we prove this then? Number one, why do we think it's an effective protest? Why? Because you highlight the judicial interference that has been made by China. You are not legitimizing it at any point. But it also means things like national security law needs to be questioned then, because you as a judge is literally going away from a situation where you cannot try to make a change. So even if you want to question the constitutional law, you cannot do that under negative side. So at the point in which we go with the principle that you are a just person, at the point in which you take yourself out of this equation, you create that particular change in which the national setting needs. So what are the impacts? A, there is an influence that you have as a foreigner judge. So you have your foreign credentials in which your reputation is used to show the extent of like harm that China has done. Comparatively, in terms of solvency, we solve the problem of constitutional law, whether it not be like done like right away, but there is a question to it that needs to be answered versus a negative side where you don't even have a pathway to that. But number two, understand that this is in the context of the Court of Final Appeal. They have no original jurisdiction, and even if you have the hierarchy of courts, your power is still on the precedent. And at the same time, you are interpreting a constitutional that is based on what CCP believes on. The impact becomes A, you have limited power, but B, there is a big question from the international setting, understanding why exactly a person with credential, a foreigner, is resigning themselves away from the regime that no longer practice democracy, and you can no longer review things that actually matters within the people of Hong Kong. If you believe in a world where law actually exists, not only on paper, you go with side affirmative.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. Now I'd like to invite the second negative.
1 second to bring out a timer.
Yep, no worries, take your time.
Starting my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Our path to victory panel is not the complete removal of China and then them bowing at our heel. It is to mitigate the extent to which China can further damage Hong Kong. Because proposition probably agrees that China, in the implementation of the national security law, has severely damaged the integrity of the Hong Kong structure. What we are telling you is that the removal or subsequent leaving of the 3 previous judges have degraded the Hong Kong structure. We tell you that one more judge is probably going to be the tipping point for a cascade of en masse resignations, or at that point in time, the complete collapse of democracy in Hong Kong. Two things we're going to be responding to from proposition. Firstly, this general idea that you need to leave. 3 levels of response to this. 1, they tell us that you are a witness to a crumbling legal fraternity, which is bad. That you become puppets to the Chinese state because your inability to perform your role makes the judiciary look bad. It's justified to apparently now pull out. Let's be fair here and pretend that these judges can do something, right? That something probably doesn't extend to rewriting the Hong Kong constitution, right? Or unilaterally granting them independence. But it also doesn't mean that proposition's assertion stands that you're a dead fish is functional because you're just puppet to the Chinese state. We think at the very least, right? You can mitigate damage that the national security laws done in Hong Kong, such as granting pardons, correctly interpreting the definition of a terrorist, etc. What this means then is what proposition argues, such as how you don't get effective change just because you're there or because you're appointed to the decision, does not account for the definition of effective and completely ignores the fact on the info slide that says, oh, the decisions that they have are incredibly influential in terms of the decisions that actually get passed in terms of Hong Kong courts. Obviously, if their benchmarks of success on proposition side is the complete removal of China, no one in this debate is getting that. I don't think that's exactly a fair thing to base their standards on. Secondly, proposition says that you become puppets, and this is harmful as the Chinese government gets more influence. These individuals are not held in concentration camps and brainwashed to be pro-Chinese activists, right? They are foreign nationals with their independent interests and the interests of their state at heart. LO already proves that these individuals probably have some degrees of protection that ward away these potential harms such as Chinese influence, which comes in the form of diplomatic community or as the security forces, which further decreases the propensity for proposition harms to come through, even if they would stand anyway. Third and final level response to this. DPM starts their speech by saying that China is already interfering with Hong Kong law. They explain that because of this, there is no point in staying and that you are just not able to do anything of efficiency. They do not explain the extent to which occurs. They just say, oh, China is already influencing, therefore no point. This is uncomparative to what we explained, to how the mere existence of the national security law means that you can be arrested for wearing a black shirt in public. The response does not stand, given that we explain how you, by being there, can start to overturn how decisions are probably made. Chinese influence is not how they paint it to be. They also said that you can't repeal laws of judges that have left the UK. Yeah, the UK judge that left just had the most of these decisions overturned. His interpretations and competence called into question by the Chinese state. This is because while Prop calls us out for apparently not understanding how the law works, right? We don't think they know what Chinese law looks like. Chinese law is not a Western liberal democracy with fair game systems. The system is skewed in favor of the CCP's interest, and Chinese law is whatever the CCP needs it to be at that point in time. Therefore, we think it's probably a fair characterization to say that the CCP probably can and has active incentives to overturn laws at the point at which individuals who started those laws are no longer there to actively defend them. Second thing I'm going to respond to is that you get support from the international scene. Two levels to this. One, apparently because you can rely on international actors, there's no drastic problem that happens. They tell us that even if you have no foreign judges, Hong Kong judges exist. No, see, the national security law also has that require that majority of all parties in Hong Kong, right, whether that become economic, judicial, to political parties, require majority participation from citizens that come from mainland China or have mainland approval. Their analysis does not work by basis of the fact that, oh, to be a Hong Kong judge in most instances, you probably do have to be a pro-Chinese activist. Second, even if you believe the mechanisms on call-out, right, and you ignore my previous analysis, this is a value-neutral benefit because it's independent of the judge leaving. We can call them out on our side externally as well. In fact, it makes more rhetorical sense to do so when you stay and try your best to defend the country. That increases the impact on calling them out internationally. So even if it's a value-neutral claim, we think we're better able to get it by virtue of impacting. The extension I'm going to be focusing on is that I think the implementation of the national security law requires foreign participation and, to an extent, the foreign intervention within the places and why that position is best left in the capacity of judges. Two levels of analysis here. One, staying does not mean that you endorse systems of abuse, because this is the implicit line of analysis that we get so far from Proposition Bench. On my first speaker's analysis, the willingness of such individuals to stay on the CFA has mitigated the damage that previous exits have already done. The most obvious reason that this damage occurs is that because foreign judges have a massive degree of influence, the loss of even one spurs on decisions that otherwise would not have been made. The harms look like further crackdowns on citizens and protesters because dissenting opinions in the form of these judges are no longer there to protect them. This is in line with the incentives of the judge intuitively, given that if they were already trying to pass legislation and decisions for the benefit of the people of Hong Kong, it would be against their interests to have harm befall them when their very presence could do something to at least mitigate that said harm. Note the word mitigation, because obviously we can't solve these problems on either side in its entirety. Therefore, the benchmark for this debate and which team should win is which team can better do actions that serve to limit the harms that would exist by virtue of sheer presence or by virtue of non-presence. In the worst case, where China now starts cracking down on judges who are high-profile individuals, this just galvanizes support from the international actors to make more drastic moves against China. Why is this probably in line with the interest of the judge and one of the better outcomes of the debate? And why is this probably better than what proposition gives you in terms of receiving the same international support? On my first speaker's analysis, where one resignation can cause resignations en masse, being arrested in China for your personal beliefs just delegitimizes China further. Second, I think this is a more proactive mechanism of getting the forms of call out they have, given that you actually have things to call out on that are more proactive, more relevant to your home country, and something necessarily more relatable than protesters in a foreign country getting arrested. Thirdly, you as a judge probably understand the risks and stake of being in this prestigious position. You consent in the potential dangers at the point that you accept appointments to incredibly influential or prestigious positions. The risk of being cracked down on is the same as if you were head of magistrate in London being shot in your townhouse because a Tory didn't like your vote. Second level of analysis, that I think you have state interests in terms of mitigating Chinese influence. Let's expand the scope of our understanding within this debate. If we take judges to essentially be state representatives, it is fair to say that several of these foreign states are actively against what China is doing, whether that be legally, economically, or politically on the spectrum. What this means is that states have an active incentive to make sure that they have a means of interacting, or in this instance, mitigating Chinese interests. This comes in the form of judges themselves. How does it relate back to the actor of the judge? Why then is it in line with their interests? The incentives to act in this manner come in the form of their personal stakes and responsibilities as citizens of their respective states. Even if they themselves do not feel any degree of sympathy or goodwill to the Hong Kong people, as you would imagine on the proposition side, the pressure from their home states to stay and remain active agents of change within the region is probably enough to say that you can affect change by presence alone. This is because even if you really legitimately do not care about the people of Hong Kong, but your state does because it makes them look good, it probably means you're going to pass decisions that try that act or go towards the benefit of the people of Hong Kong. Given previous analysis, I'd point out that if your state's interests are important to the actor, then unlike what proposition just asserts, you do have reason to uphold your state's incentives as well. Other things that prove this look like how your career is going to be significantly harmed at the point in which you are seen as conceding to the power that China wages. That is to say, even if you don't buy my previous speaker's analysis that disprove how you become a Chinese puppet, the primary reason I provide you is that you care more about yourself than China, which applies independent of whether or not you're a judge, unless you're probably a Chinese citizen from mainland China. What does this culminate to? It means that one, proposition cannot simply argue that leaving is probably in line with the interests of the judge, given that you have to accept that you probably do have competing interests, i.e. your life or limb or your interests of the country. But I think what I've given you thus far is enough to sufficiently prove that that foreign national judges do have significant vested interest, that they have consented into this position, that they have active reasonings to continue pursue and to continue to protect the goodwill of the Hong Kong people. For all these reasons opposed.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. Now I'd like to invite the third affirmative.
All right. Am I audible? Oops, sorry.
Yep, you're audible.
Okay. I'll be keeping my cam off because of internet issues.
Yeah, that's completely fine.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. This debate was supposed to operate in the sense that you look at the interest of the judge itself, where you look at the interest of the judge, in the instance that they're actually weighing whether it's worth it for them to stay within Hong Kong under the rule of China, which NEC essentially doesn't understand in today's debate, because of the fact that literally the entire judicial system is at the mercy of Xi Jinping, right? The main framing coming from NEC is that there is a moral and principled obligation for these judges to stay. We don't see how this is essentially crucial to this debate, because we also concede that judges have a duty to the rule of law in its entirety, right? We agree that these judges have to uphold the rule of law and protect constitutionality. Understand that in the context where China has a hand within Hong Kong's judicial system, they cannot essentially do that because of the fact that they're constantly going against its own constitution, right? NEC blatantly dilutes the authoritarian power and drive of the CCP as if its intervention has not already caused suffering to the people on the ground in Hong Kong. Understand that under this judicial system specifically, Hong Kong citizens can be extradited to China at the point where they dissent. Also, Chinese courts can also essentially deal with cases which are supposed to be dealt with in Hong Kong. There is a blurred line between Chinese and Hong Kong law, right? Between their judiciaries, where we understand that the CCP essentially is already working towards cracking down Hong Kong through their judicial system, right? NEC never proved to us on how these judges would protect their key decisions with which question the law from being repealed, right? Even if they posit to us that it's a rare occasion for the Chinese government to overturn CFA rulings, they never defended where the line is drawn, where they somehow don't have the incentives to overturn these decisions, which contradict the interests of China to integrate, which also go against which essentially go against Chinese interests, which is to silence the dissidents, right? This debate essentially, just reiterating, has to be about the interests of the judge, not about what's best for the Hong Kong people, but also will deal with that premise because essentially that is what they're contending, right? NEC needs to prove three fundamental things. Firstly, that the judicial system in Hong Kong immensely needs foreign judges, that they cannot rely on Hong Kong judges. Next, that these foreign judges would be able to fulfill their purpose as judges of common law, even in the instance of constant interference, even at their own premise where the last straw is one last judge. We don't see how they have leverage. They also have to prove that Hong Kong judges essentially cannot operate based on the precedents that have already been set within this judicial system, where it is already mature due to the prior presence of foreign judges, right? Which is not necessary now that the judicial system, as we've clarified from both speakers, is already matured, right? Understand that I have an important clarification here, is that NEC cannot take the wording of the motion lightly without considering the context of China's constant effort to crack down on Hong Kong and integrate, right? Because they constantly try to question our fiat of how essentially like the occasions of overturning is rare, right? Understand that even if you see that it's rare, understand that you already see the shockwaves of how CCP is trying to crack down on Hong Kong. The CCP is already actively silencing dissidents and the voices of the anti-China movement. OP needs to prove that the judges can ultimately challenge the CCP that is dedicated to silencing dissidents on the ground, which extends to their judicial system. OP also needs to prove that the decisions made by these foreign judges will not be interfered with, which we have never heard on their side of the house. All we get from them is that they have some sort of moral stance that, okay, I'm here, therefore I'm defending them, but to what extent of practicality, right? We agree that these judges will not mimic the decisions of the CCP because they have this duty to rule of law, which is why we posit that resigning is the largest marker of the unacceptability of the ignorance towards rule of law that the CCP is already exercising. Understand that, sure, judges can initially question the legality of the law, but where Xi Jinping actively silences dissidents on the ground, the same harm goes into interfering with the judicial system, where they can overturn these judgments made by the foreign judges, right? Even operating on their own premise, how do you see one final like foreign judge being able to defend the entire Hongkong like judicial system? We don't see how that is possible, and they've never proven to us the practicalities of that argument, right? On the context of the law itself, we need to re-clarify this because they essentially don't understand how this law is oppressive, how this law is already in place, how this law cannot be like how this law could not be spoken against, which is why you already have like foreign judges resigning in the first place. The Chinese security law is inherently oppressive. Firstly, there's things like detention without trial. There's allowing disproportionate power to the authorities to violate your privacy. They also exercise censorship through this law, right? This law is already inherently bad. But even if we're not talking about the context of this law itself, the Chinese government has authority and has the autonomy to essentially exercise interpretation of the basic Hong Kong law, right? The exercise of the national security law is a byproduct of the strategy of the CCP to silence dissidents within Hong Kong. The Standing Committee in China sets the law in Hong Kong, which allows the Communist Party to interpret the basic law of Hong Kong, which is why we don't see how essentially you having these foreign judges have ever dealt with the interpretations which CCP wants to maintain, right? The immense harms can also be seen where like instances of damaging public transport is deemed equal by the law to terrorism, right? Because they want to like strengthen their authority against dissidents, or essentially like prove that they have some sort of authority that cannot be messed with, right? As authoritarians. Next, the context of the role of foreign judges. Panel, we understand that there's a moral obligation not to the people of Hong Kong, but to the rule of law. At the point where judges dismiss their obligation to the rule of law, they are also failing people on the ground that are the Hong Kong citizens. Foreign judges firstly were placed there to essentially develop the law in Hong Kong. This means that at the point where they have already previously assisted the development of law in Hong Kong, you essentially don't need them anymore because you have precedents set in place that allow for judges within Hong Kong itself to like operate based on these laws, right? However, this is a mismatched solution coming from NEC, that you essentially want these judges to stay within a system that they cannot change, where they stay, where they cannot essentially develop any further because of the stronghold that the CCP has on this judicial system. I understand that Hong Kong judges will suffice because there is no unique expertise needed from foreign common law judges, and this is because of the fact that Hong Kong has already prospered from it. However, now the context is that China has a stronghold on them. The interest of foreign judges then is firstly the development of the Hong Kong judicial system, like I explained earlier. Secondly, to refuse to participate in an institution, and this is the most important one, that has been interfered with by the CCP, especially where it undermines the rule of law. NEC has to defend an institution which cannot defend rule of law. There's no point to remain in a position that is designed against your authority and plays you like a pawn. Even on their premise, they need to prove that the last judge can combat the CCP, which is highly unlikely. Understand that the judges resigning in the first place is already acting as an effective protest, where they firstly highlight the extent of judicial interference, which cannot be changed, and secondly, highlight the issues with the security law, which was the ultimate reasoning for these judges pulling out. The context of intervention of the Chinese government is so important because the CCP will overturn your decisions at a point where you attempt to review the constitutionality of this law, and the fact that your presence is a mere validation to the legitimacy of the court. For all those reasons,
Right, thank you very much for that fine speech. Now, to conclude the substantive portion of this debate, I'd like to invite the third negative.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. The win condition of affirmative is simple, that when you resign, you uphold justice. Note that they never fully mechanized why this is the case. In fact, we know that if you resign, it becomes a concession that justice itself is going to be fragile. This just points out that while affirmative concedes that the judge should uphold justice, it is unclear how resigning does that, and therefore they don't meet the goal of their debate. Why affirmative fails is because they shift their characterization very easily, panel. They say that China cracks down very extremely, but at the same time, at second and third, suggests that local Hong Kong judges are going to be effective to uphold your developed law. And if it's true that China is extreme, these local Hong Kong lawyers become more vulnerable precisely because they are from Hong Kong. It is easy to paint them out as dissenters. Compare this to the diplomatic security that federal judges offer. And therefore, even if China is going to be extreme, they can't harm these federal judges precisely because that will inspire the international community to bolster against China. What this merely proves is that affirmative never proves to what extent local Hong Kongers are going to be effective in holding back China, nor do they tell us why ours is not better. In this speech, I'll prove to you who is the actor and what are their interests, but also on where do we create change in Hong Kong. Who is the actor and what are their interests? We told you at Constructives that a federal judge have several motivations, that they have dedicated their entire lives for their jobs and probably have trained and went to universities, that being appointed as a federal judge means that it is one of the highest point of their career, that they want to maximize their career precisely because of the limited time that they have, that they carry the interests of their home states. And since most of these states are democratic, this means that this federal judge is also strongly democratic as well. What this means is that it means that there is a large incentive for the federal judge to stay even with the crackdown of China because they are motivated by these different factors. They say at affirmative that, well, you cannot do anything anyway, and therefore you become illegitimate. Note that this is contradictory to the frame that they forward at first. If it's true that CFA and Hong Kong is democratic like first half suggests, it fiats that there is already resistance in the crackdown of China, precisely because there are protests like second affirmative says. There is a fight that is already happening on the ground. This is why it's better if we stay, precisely because as a virtue of the info slide, first, you still have a majority of your federal judge staying, but secondly, that you have the capacity to pass better laws and uphold better arbitrations, precisely because you are a competent judge. You have the ability to reinforce the CFA's ruling, precisely like the info slide says, because China rarely overturns CFA ruling, because they are scared that when they do this, it's likely that the international community sees this as an attack to their own federal judge. Therefore, if you are talking about looking illegitimate and being a signal of failing democracy, it becomes worse inside affirmative, precisely because you resign without doing anything. You resign while there are protests on the ground. You resign while some of the judges stay. You become a signal that the crackdown works, and this is why you resign in the first place. In the worst case, that it is hard for you to exercise your power inside opposition. At the very least, in some cases, we are able to put up a resistance. We're able to make China's crackdown harder and therefore longer for it to become effective. This is better because if looking illegitimate is in this debate is a value that is bad, this tells you that it becomes worse inside affirmative. It's better inside opposition because to some degree we're able to prolong the harm that China is able to do inside this debate. Compare this to the harms they never addressed down the bench. At the point in time that you resign, you lessen the resistance against China. Therefore, first, you betray your life's work because China can repeal all of your work. You betray your state's interest. Therefore, you fail your mandate, but you also become a concession that China's pernicious policies are working. And lastly, that you're able to inspire a cascade of resignation because your colleagues feel that you left them out, that they likely feel alone. On all ends, you make Hong Kong vulnerable, you make your life's work vulnerable. It becomes easy for them to delegitimize your life works and colleagues' work, something that you clearly care about. It is clear, therefore, that at the end of this issue, it is unlikely for this person to resign. But even if you did not believe this, we tell you that at the point in time that you become irritating to China, precisely because you hamper how they crack down, it's likely they're going to harm you and deport you at the worst case. China will resist more. This is good because it inspires the international community to support you more, precisely because you are forcibly removed rather than just voluntarily resigning. Second, where do we create change in Hong Kong? Affirmative says that these judges are used by China to justify that Hong Kong is still democratic. They say that we have to resign to remove the justification because Hong Kong is already developed and we already have Hong Kong lawyers. At a point in time that it is developed, you have to go out. Know that this is weird because the context that affirmative provides shows that there is a crackdown on the law that you developed in the first place. This is why the development is getting damaged. It is why at the point in time that China is doing this, you fulfill the standard that affirmative asserts. Precisely because what you develop is under threat and scrutiny, it's likely that you want to stay there to preserve it being developed in the first place. And this just confirms that if we're talking about the standard that affirmative suggests, opposition clearly meets that standard. Note, but secondly, we note that with or without these judges, China can no longer hide within the veil that they are good, precisely because of the massive crackdown that they have. But also, that is precisely because of what affirmative said, right? That there are protests and unrest, that there's likely going to be media attention that shows that China is bad. Therefore, even if it's true that these judges are being used, it is unclear to what extent is this successful. I flip this and suggest that judges being used by China to justify the rule of democracy means in opposition, means to the already existing international attention, means that China looks more bad because it's likely that the international community sees this as a small screen effect that China does to skirt accountability, which means that it's likely that the international community supports us more because they see China being desperate and using their own federal judge. But secondly, that the international community is not stupid. They understand that this is a strategy that China does. Therefore, support of the international community is likely going to be symmetric. If the support of the international community is a benefit that you care for this debate, what you have to weigh this for is based on proximity. In affirmative, because you resign and you go outside of Hong Kong, you have less information about how China cracks down the rule of law and democracy. Therefore, even if you protest in your beach or whatever in Ohio, it is unclear why it becomes successful because you no longer have international knowledge, internal knowledge, right? But moreover, your protests are no longer beneficial precisely because you're not inside. You're not at risk and at the forefront of the fight. It is easy for China to point out you as just an annoying white man that's just calling them out. This is why it's unclear to what extent you're able to highlight China being bad if you're outside and away from Hong Kong. To what extent are you going to be legitimate if in both houses reputation and the popularity of the judge is symmetrical? What matters the most is proximity. Compare this to what you get inside opposition. It's precisely because you're inside that you get more internal information about how China cracks down. Therefore, your protests are going to be more meaningful because you can detail the atrocities of China. Importantly, you are also very beneficial because you're inside. Your protests are seen as more legitimate because you have insider info. Therefore, you're able to galvanize more international support. This issue just concludes to you that if we're talking about international support, clearly in extent and proximity of opposition gets that better.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. Now on to the reply section of this debate. Firstly, I'd like to invite the negative reply.
Starting my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Panel, firstly, I would invite you to ignore like the 5th or 6th minute onward from government whip as they were just building at that point. Actually, no, you can probably still credit that if you want because the debate was lost for them at first exchange. The best case that proposition can get in this case is you call out China and you stop becoming a puppet, and that's probably the most they can get. Notice that all those things are probably symmetric if you buy their harms anyway. The worst case that they forward on to us is that you remain a Chinese puppet and are brainwashed. By the way, this is contradictory because if you were that much of a puppet as prop suggests, then there's no existing incentive to leave anyway. There are two standards I want to look at this debate from. Firstly, why are you better to uphold the value of the law in your capacity to judge? Second, you look at this from the perspective of a judge. Firstly, in upholding the value of the law, we told that you're probably better able to maintain legal order. Proposition's mitigatory mechanisms are local Hong Kong judges. This is also while they are running China controls judges in Hong Kong. And then, funny enough, they call us out for failing that we don't prove that we can defend the laws that stand at whip. See the problem there? They're debating against themselves. They're responding to themselves for us. So, given that contradictory analysis, what should you buy? Our material. Because then what their responsive material at this point in time is, or what stands left is, the CCP is in control anyway, and this is the bulk of their framing that justifies their case. Proposition relies on the premise that the CCP is already in control of Hong Kong. This is the only circumstance to which the case can stand. What we tell you then is that while the CCP does exert a significant degree of influence, obviously foreign judges have reasons as to why they have stayed there for years already, and that reason is that they were effective at mitigating Chinese influence. They existed to stay to protect the Hong Kong people, whether that be because they had personal vested interests in protecting them, or because they had external factors that necessitated their involvement in these matters that points towards the conclusion that they're trying to protect the Hong Kong people anyway, whether or not they legitimately cared for them on a personal level. Second standard then, in terms of judges, you probably have an obligation to the rule of law, right? The rule of law is to protect the people. Even the worst case that the letter of the law is against them, they still have the mechanism to fight the spirit of the law. This is non-existent of proposition when you leave the country. All the analysis here was to say that there is an inherent value to the judges staying in Hong Kong, that they can still exercise their powers normally, just that they would have to fight harder than they normally would have. Proposition then suggests, oh, you have to prioritize the judge over the Hong Kong people because this is an actor debate. This is because prop posits that by virtue of this being an actor debate, foreign judges only care about themselves. Other actors are now not important. This is just bypassing our analysis as to how external factors are likely to mean that other actors in positions are going to matter for the judge in question. This is because these the responsibilities are principally imposed on you, whether that be by virtue of your position as a judge in that country, whether that be by virtue of your position as being appointed by your state as a representative. Now, the final question then becomes, is it worth for them to stay? And this is the largest problem that proposition posits. They said that it's no longer worth it for the judge to decide if the Hong Kong or to stay there, because if the Hong Kong is under CCP, we said that as long as you were there and that your interest is to do the best in your work and to carry out the pro-democratic and pro-Hong Kong values of your home country or your personal values, you still have the propensity to counterbalance the forces of the CCP. This is because we said that it's worthy for us to stay because we're one of the only bodies that is able to contest China in the rule of law at the point in time, specifically in Hong Kong. Notice that the counterfactual on our side, on their side, they have to rely on things like international courts, which China probably in most cases just ignores, much like they tell us they'll ignore the fact that these judges will make decisions. Notice that there are no longer hurdles for China to be completely pernicious against Hong Kong and further oppress their citizens. Internationally, call-outs are happening because we can do it on both sides, right? And we get to co-opt that better because of the fact that we are still exerting efforts internally to counter these kinds of threats. What this means then is that when they say it's protest enough to walk out and resign, this is a virtue signaling on their part. It's much more utile for you to stay. In fact, that's the very protest. The fact that you exist there, that you stay, you continue to hamper Chinese efforts because for every law they pass that you hate, you all can also interpret that law in a way that benefits Hong Kong citizens. I don't understand where proposition is coming from. Vote negative.
Right. Thank you very much for that fine speech. Finally, I'd like to invite the affirmative reply.
Just checking, am I audible?
Yep, clear.
All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2.
Negative lives in a utopia of not being engaging at all with the context that we've given, the analysis that we've provided, and not even trying to understand the idea in which that you already gave way for these judicial precedents to be overturned by the force of the Chinese state government. You're living within walls, you're making sure that freedom is only within the walls that you contain. We tell to you that the moment that you allow, and these are the things that will actually happen, because once these judicial reviews, even if it is like not likely, right? But the fact that it was even overturned means that constitutional rights that are the hallmark of democracy is being subverted by Chinese influence. Maybe you should have engaged with that if you were so confident you were going to win this debate. Two things I'll do. Number one, we go on for a few clarifications what this debate is supposed to be about and what it could have been better on the side negative. But number two, on the clashes that we should, like, that remains clear that we should be taking this debate. Number one, understand that the Chinese state government has always been cracking down, and this is a form of non-engagement coming from negative in terms of the context in which, for example, the standing committee can subvert the laws in Hong Kong, regardless of whatever the foresight is already given, because that is just factually correct. The chief executive is already appointed by the CCP. The democratic practice can only be through the rule of law, but even that is being overturned by the judicial precedents by the Chinese state government. Number two, understand the extent of judicial interference is major, it's detrimental. The propensity has been increasing. And we've told you since my speech, throughout the whole team has been talking about how the propensity has been increasing. You do not get to get away, and like panel just notice how they never even try to engage with the worst case scenario in the situation that this propensity has been increasing and influence has been there the whole time. We tell to you that this necessarily means that the CFA has its integrity corroded. You're going to subvert the idea of precedents to be used by mainland China. What this also means is that you're going to legitimize the Chinese government. They do not, and they agree with the idea that there is going to be extrajudicial territories. There is going to be extrajudicial things that happen, right? It's also the way that you get to actually like just crack down as to what is considered as terrorism according to what the Chinese state government is telling you to do. I don't know how else that is going to be in terms of like that is not like it's a very subjective, ambiguous, and how it is very much appointed to the political influence. How China is going to like interpret that. I don't really know how it's possible for them to say that the Hong Kong CFA is still going to be able to do forms of interpretation that is not just going to cancel the constitutional rights that they already have, but the fact that it's going to be replaced by judicial precedents coming from the Chinese state government. It's major that we understand that only these people are the ones that can do the constitutional rights, like that can uphold constitutional rights through judicial precedents, and you are cancelling that. That is why we already told to you it's necessary to understand that this means that they're going to be the puppets of the Chinese state government. You're not going to be able to actually uphold your so-called mandate, which goes to my clashes. Number one, on the principal clash, if your role is already ineffective and you're not even being capable of speaking up against the Chinese state government, you do not do anything within the interest of the Hong Kong people, because your mandate can only be done if you can perform your role effectively. If you don't have any authority now, and the fact that your judicial reviews can be cancelled anyways, it comes at a cost in which that even if you stay, this means that you actually are legitimizing, or actually even worse, overturning judicial precedents that is necessary for the democracy of Hong Kong people. But number two, the propensity of the Chinese influence is very important, because the role of law is important, because the problem here is in so far, the interpretation has always been within Hong Kong jurisdiction. But now that the Chinese state government, even a minimal influence is enough to overturn something that is very quintessential, like the freedom of speaking out, the freedom of speech, the freedom of movement, the freedom of being associated with a certain press or opinion. The fact is that we win on three metrics. Number one, we tell you that because you are affecting your judge credibility, this means that it's not going to be something that's worth it for you to stay. Number two, you don't get to perform the role in the interest of the Hong Kong people in which you are mandated. But lastly, in terms of like you are not being able to uphold justice, and especially being the puppets of China, this means at the end of the day, affirmative has to take this debate.
Right, thank you very much for that fine speech, and thank you for the entire round. Stop the recording here. Right, so thank you very much for the debate. what I'll do in my OA is I'll just give the verdict straight away and then justify the verdict. If you have any questions or if you want any feedback, you can approach us later. Both of the judges in the room also had an excellent insight into the round. So yeah, I recommend you approach them too. So this was a consensus decision, and the side that took the debate is the negative. So the negative won this debate on a 3-0. Well, obviously, like the trainee does not have a ballot, so 2-0 in reality. I think this debate was quite difficult to judge in some parts. The reason being that there was not much meticulous work done to prove ideas that you had, which were all interesting and promising. And the main reason as to why we thought that the negative took this round was because, comparatively speaking, the negative was successful in proving that within the system, you do have some, although not large, ability to change and challenge the CCP, whereas comparatively on the other side of the affirmative, it wasn't really clear how there is an additional impact on legitimization of the CCP and abuses committed by the Chinese government. The first thing I'm going to look at in this OA, in terms of justification, is what the interests of the actor are and which one we thought was the most important thing in the debate. So to start off with, I think both the affirmative side and the negative side agree that this actor cares deeply about administering justice, i.e. to do good and to not do bad within the judicial system. The affirmative side characterizes this as the most important thing at the start of the first affirmative speech, because this person spent a lot of time studying law, which indicates their interest and dedication to the field. And the negative side also agree with this when they talk about how this actor cares about being judicious, how this actor is probably a competent person as a judge, and therefore dedicates a lot of time and interest in the field of law and justice. I think this was the most important consideration in this debate in two key parts, or in two key aspects. The first is that all the other interests that both teams talk about kind of is really influenced and informed by the first interest that I've just explained to you in my OA, i.e., for example, the affirmative talks about moral obligation to law as a judge. The negative talks about legacy. They also talk about mandate to perform professionally, for example, and be loyal to the democratic country and values from which you come. But if you look at this in detail, like all of these things are influenced by the outcome of the first interest. Because if it is true that staying, for example, does more good in terms of administering justice, then presumably the moral obligation that the affirmative side is talking about, the legacy that the negative side is talking about, the mandate that the negative side is talking about is also kind of bolstered, and it matches those interests as well, and vice versa. In an instance where staying is bad, then you're actively kind of, walking away from moral obligation, tarnishing your legacy, and going away from your mandate as well. So these things are necessarily impacted by the first interest, which puts these interests below the initial interest that both teams agree is important. The second thing I just want to clarify is that I think the negative talks a lot about how security is unlikely to be a big consideration in this debate. They talk about how these judges have consented to being a judge in Hong Kong, knowing the fact that there's a lot of abusive actions committed by the CCP and so on. And they also talk about the degree of protection that is granted to these judges. So you're likely to be protected anyways. This is not directly important, but it will be important later on in evaluating some of the materials that come out from both teams. But I think the implication here is that the pursuit of justice is probably more important than self-interest, or more like protection, because you won't really be exposed to such risks in the first instance. And I don't think there was a lot of challenges to this from the affirmative in the first place, which I think kind of makes it, I guess, which kind of makes the negative claim stick in this round. So based on that, the most important question in this debate, obviously, is whether or not resigning would facilitate or obstruct CCP abuse. So whether or not, it is more effective to stay within or resign. And I think there are two key areas of discussion here. The first is whether or not you have any capacity to challenge the system from within, so internal mechanisms of checks and balances, and whether or not that is effective. And secondly, which side has stronger messaging effect. So this has to do with international criticism and how that's effective or not effective on either side. Firstly, let's look at internal systems. The first thing I just want to clarify here is that I think this clash was evaluated largely based on consequences, objective consequences, and i.e. what ends up happening in Hong Kong and whether or not the situation in Hong Kong will improve or deteriorate. And the reason why I'm clarifying this is that I think there is an alternative perspective that could have been made use of in this round, i.e. how individuals feel like working inside the system. So maybe even if you're not doing an active harm or active additional harm to Hong Kong as a society, you might still feel something out of that, or out of being in the system as opposed to being outside of the system. And there might have been a potential for an argument, but that was not something that was explained by either side of this debate. So this is largely like largely an evaluation of what ends up happening in Hong Kong objectively and whether or not that is better for people inside Hong Kong. So the affirmative's claim is simple. It is that you're likely to be a puppet of the CCP, you're likely to waste your effort, and you're likely to contribute to legitimization of the Chinese rule, which is quite bad in the status quo. The main reason as to why I don't think this claim was very strong throughout the debate was because of lack of mechanization. The first challenge that comes out from the negative side is on how this judge is likely to act within the system. Because I think the implicit, characterization here from the affirmative is that they are likely to cooperate with the CCP in one way or the other. I think the negative side were able to explicitly challenge this by saying that these judges are likely to continue on challenging the system. And this is firstly because they characterize their belief and mandate to be one of democratic value as opposed to cooperation with China. But secondly, they were able to show that these judges are uniquely in a position of security, which gives them the capacity to challenge CCP without risking personal exposure to danger. And this means, I think the negative were able to show that it is unlikely to be the case that these judges will be used as a puppet in terms of, legitimizing the rule of the CCP. Given this, I think what the affirmative side had to prove to kind of make this argument stick was why these judges are more likely to cooperate with the CCP than what the negative side suggests, i.e. they're unlikely to cooperate with the CCP and rather challenge the rule, or why even if judges, challenge the CCP and try to do something about it, that will still end up assisting CCP. That would still end up legitimizing the CCP rule. And I think neither of those things are proven from the affirmative. So it wasn't really clear why having a judge within the system that actively challenges CCP decisions was something that adds to the legitimization of the Chinese rule, which both teams agreed was kind of symmetric on either side, because China would do so anyways to a significant degree. So that's my evaluation of the affirmative. I don't think that you were able to substantiate a meaningful marginal difference there. On a comparative, the negative's claim is that you're likely to be able to provide a counter narrative to China, and that is likely to be able to hold the CCP to account in some instances, although not in all instances, obviously. The first thing I want to note is I think the affirmative side challenges this throughout the debate by saying, well, the CCP is abusive anyways, and you won't have the capacity to challenge them on either side. You talked about how there's lack of capacity to challenge the system internally. You also, because it's just one judge, and you also talked about how the CCP has the ability to control and interpret constitutions on either side. I agree with the side affirmative that the CCP will not allow these judges to challenge the most foundational aspects of the constitution, for example. But I think the negative side has some say in it as well, when they talk about how they don't fully control these systems, and it is historically rare for the CCP to overturn every decision made by the CFA. So the conclusion of this is that obviously I don't think the CCP would allow judges to meaningfully tackle the core of the system, but as the second negative and third negative's characterization, you are likely to have some smaller degree of ability to counter the CCP. For example, how you define terrorism. For example, whether or not you choose to detain a particular individual or not. I think that's a scope of. There's a degree of ability to save certain number of individuals, although the scale of which might not be that massive. And given that, I think the characterization from the negative, I think what they were able to show is that despite the fact that you don't have overwhelming power, you still have some capacity to, I guess, do some good for the people in Hong Kong. There are a number of additional challenges from the side affirmative. Number one, this is just one judge. You won't be able to do anything about it. I think the negative side provides a response to this by saying that this is likely to create a cascading effect where you have more judges opting out of the system. Admittedly, I don't think the mechanisms here from the negative were excellent, but I don't think there's a meaningful pushback from the affirmative either, which kind of proves that this might create larger influence into the future if you choose to resign. Secondly, the affirmative side claims that this is not unique because, there are other, kind of implicit, but this might not be unique. There are other people that can challenge the system as well, to which I think the third negative provides quite a persuasive response by saying, it is uniquely you as a foreign judge that has the capacity to challenge these systems because you're immune from things like punishment. So I do think the negative were able to show that you firstly have a degree of ability to challenge the system, and you're in a uniquely gifted position to be able to do that. At the conclusion, I think the negative were able to show that there's a marginal influence that you possess as a judge right now by staying, whereas there's very little additional change in terms of how China's rule is legitimized, which is the claim from the affirmative. So I think the negative side takes this clash. Lastly, I want to talk about messaging effect and international criticism. The claim from the affirmative is that resigning would create and signal sign of interference by the CCP, and this means that the international community would criticize the Chinese Communist Party. The negative side pushes back on two levels. Firstly, that calling out is more effective when you choose to remain inside the system because you're likely to be internally active, you have a lot of information and experiences, and people are likely to see you as being in a risky position and also, as a result, in a relevant position, which means people are likely to care about and pay attention to you. Secondly, I think the negative side were able to show that when you get hurt inside the system, that's when you have a lot more attention. For example, when you get arrested, for example, when you're forced into resignation and so on. This second claim is probably not very strong because I don't think the negative were able to reconcile this analysis with an inconsistency that exists throughout their case, i.e., your characterization is that people are likely to be protected. In that instance, the likelihood of these risks visiting upon the judge is not really massive, in my opinion. But regardless of that, I think there are multiple reasons as to why this clash was at best a wash for the wash, and at worst, I think the won by the negative side. That is firstly, because I think despite the fact that there is a degree of intuition in the affirmative's case that this might be a big thing and you might have a lot of attention because you're resigning, you are not really successful in mechanizing why resignation in particular creates a more, creates a bigger scale of attention and criticisms to the CCP. Whereas I think the negative were able to show that you have more people paying attention because you're in the system and you have more opportunity to speak out about these things in the first place. So I think there's a lack of mechanization problem in the affirmative case. But secondly, I don't think this is really weighed in the debate. So even if, you have more capacity to attract people's attention because you're resigning, it's a big thing, that is never weighed up against the negative side's claim on, how you're likely to be able to call out on small things on a more regular basis and so on. So even if I believe that there's a degree of mechanization, that is not really weighed up against the negative, which means that you're not necessarily proving that you have won this clash. But even if I don't believe any of those things, I don't think this clash on external checks and balances and external criticisms is enough for the affirmative to take the debate over the negative, because I think this clash was less important than what happens internally within the system, for the reason that there is a lack of mechanization from the affirmative and the negative, to be fair, as to how international criticisms are likely to be effective in holding the CCP to account, in changing the situation in Hong Kong, and so on. So the conclusion of this is that I think the negative were able to deal with the affirmative's claim on international criticisms, if not flip it, And even if this clash was important, it is still not as important as the first clash, which was won by the negative. So for all of those reasons, I think the negative were able to show that this individual would be able to create a larger scale of influence by staying inside the system as opposed to resigning, and which ties the arguments back to the first interest that we both teams agreed was important in the round, i.e. doing good for the people in Hong Kong. And that is why the negative side took this debate on a consensus. Yeah, that's my OA. Thank you very much for the round. I really enjoyed it, and good luck in the final round. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the OA. Where will it